tell us a little bit about what you know about the marketplace. And the reason I asked Nash to do this is he's really at the peak of the industry. He's at the very, very top as it relates to breeding great quality animals. He's got tremendous investment into his business around fallow deer and axis deer, and he's also an incredibly straightforward, dependable, accountable guy. I've never heard anything but extraordinarily positive things about him and what he does, and so I felt he would be a great representative for the fallow industry to come and share with you guys a little bit about why that's a great marketplace and why it's something you might want to consider for investment. Come on up, Nash.
Thank you, Brian. The presentation, I'll get it sent in to them later. There's a little bit of issue on that, but the good thing is Brian covered a lot of it earlier with a lot of the incentives and the numbers and things like that. It's just a different species and a different value associated with them. But some of the things, so I'll also be able to make up a little time on this presentation, but some of the things about fallow, just to get you started on why we got into it, is I started off as a whitetail person, and we were raising whitetail, and I liked it because whitetail is a consumable. Every year, they're going to a pasture, they're going to get shot, ranchers need them all the time. And so that was nice to be able to raise animals that ultimately ended at a bullet every year. So that was really nice. You didn't have to sit there and struggle to find a buyer or anything like that. Always selling out of whitetail. So then I started paying attention to the fallow market, and I actually just was looking at some pasture land that I had, and I said, man, that it's not enough land to really run cattle on. It's already high fenced. I said, what can I throw out there that'll make sense to me? And I had black buck out there, but it was too small of a pasture that every time I'd get to the point where I was like, all right, I've got some shooters to sell, they'd start killing each other, fighting, and whatnot. I said, well, that sucks. I just keep on losing money there. So I started looking at the fallow, and I showed up to one of the auctions, a live auction, and the fallow were running through there, and I saw some yearlings start to be sold for $400 a pop. I said, that's like a 7-month-old weanling / yearling going for that. I started thinking about the numbers on how that associated with the cattle and how many I could run on 20 acres, and I started looking at it, and I said, man, I could just run fallow and make the same amount of money. It doesn't even matter. They're just, people aren't paying attention to the antlers on their head. They're just selling them straight through the cattle barn, $400 a piece. So I started pursuing that aspect of it. Then I said, well, if I'm gonna spend that money, I might as well just get a good buck and go that route, because then I can bring a little bit more just by spending a little bit more on the sire. So I started looking into all that, saw the increase on fallow going up. I called somebody and I just asked him straight up, I said, well, where's the best fallow I can find? And he told me of a guy down the road from us, and he said, that's the best fallow that I know of that's for sale. So we ended up just buying out a whole herd at that time. And that was about 350 head of fallow. So it went from just a little experiment to, hey, this is a full-fledged breeding operation now that we're gonna go in on. And again, the thing that I liked about it was it's a consumable animal. And so I said, well, I'm gonna start doing this just like whitetail. We're gonna put them in breeding pens. We're gonna have smaller enclosures. And that's something that I liked about cervids and antlered animals, is because you can raise them in a smaller area, and all you have to do is basically supplement the feed for them. And so all of a sudden you can take 70 acres, and I have close to 1,000 animals on 70 acres now. And I can't do that with antelope species. Like I mentioned earlier, the black buck just fought too much when I had them confined. So I was able to do it that way. And then again, because I'm able to turn out shooters and sell them to ranches, it's constantly just a revolving door there. And the other thing about the cervids is, because they're an antlered animal, we can just cut their antlers off every year whenever they strip out and keep them together, and you don't have that death loss like you would on other species there. So that was some of the huge incentives for us there is I saw that different things. Well, the thing that I noticed too with the fallow that is pretty unique, and I kind of just ran through it, is there's almost 3 separate models that you can really make work depending on what level of capital investment that you want to make into them. Because there is a sustainable just venison side market to fallow, and I know several breeders that have been doing it for decades just off of venison production, and then they go ahead and take the antlers, they turn the antlers into dog chews, and they sell those, and they make a pretty decent income off of doing it that way. Then you have the middle model, which I call is like your stocker shooter model, where you're just raising stuff for the ranches the hunting ranches that need fallow shooters for their ranches. And that model works very well as well. And then you have the high-end elite genetic side of it, where breeders like myself, and I see Jason in here, and some other guys that are breeding the biggest of the biggest. We're chasing world records. We're trying to be able to supply breeder bucks to people that can greatly enhance their genetics on their ranches. And, that is at the upper end of the market. And, those are kind of the anomalies, if you will. But being realistic, 90% of that stock still goes to hunting ranches just to end up being shooters. So keeping that in mind. The axis deer kind of is the same way for us. The problem with the axis deer is they grow better in the pasture once you turn them out. So you really have to prove your genetics a lot harder with the axis, just because they're a much higher stress rigor animal for antler development. Trophy hunt shooter side aspect of it is fallow shooters have been increasing tremendously. And part of that reason is what I was going to get to is that whitetail is being completely overregulated, and all these hunting ranches need something to shoot. Hunters don't stop wanting to hunt every year. There's just less and less of a supply of whitetail going out to these hunting ranches, so they're looking for other aspects to it. And that's what has really increased the shooter market price for fallow the past several years, and I've just seen it growing. Even as what Brian said earlier, when prices started dropping off for other exotic species, that kind of ran hand in hand with overregulation of whitetail and whitetail breeders getting out of it, where the fallow steadily kept going up and up and up on shooter prices. To the point where this year, shooter, stocker, fallow bucks were going on an average close to $10,000 a shooter from our ranch. And that's up by almost 100% actually. Several years ago it was like $5,500 a shooter, and now we're close to $10,000 per shooter that's going out to these ranches. That's kind of the same thing with the axis deer. I'm seeing the shooter prices climb on those as well. And that's because those are consumable animals. I call them consumable animals because they are just always needing to be replenished year after year after year. And the clientele, this year alone, I've had to tell so many people, I'm sorry, I'm sold out, I don't have enough. So people are constantly wanting to buy some breeding stock and some does from us, and it's very hard to let go of the females because I just simply cannot raise enough males to supply the demand that I'm constantly facing there. So obviously year after year that price being able to increase, and I only see it based off of what Brian has said and what we've seen in the past since in 2017 when that hit. I really just don't see an end in sight for these animals in the foreseeable future. I just see it going up and up and up because I've said it back then and he's saying it today. I mean, you're essentially buying these animals at 60% off. So the value that you're seeing associated with them, if you start looking at it through what Brian mentioned earlier and that lens, makes a big difference. On the breeder side of things, the other thing that's pretty neat about it is just even from the semen straw side of it, we collect these animals, and because they're a deer species and people have been AIing them and running them through facilities and barns and things of that nature, you have semen prices going from anywhere from $1,000 a straw up to $6,000 plus per straw, which is pretty incredible to think about whenever a breeder sire buck can, on average give you around 60, 65 straws per collection. And you can collect him, multiple times a year, but on, most people will collect 2 to 3 times a year on their prized sires.
I've got two questions.
Yes, sir.
One of them is, when you're talking about selling the shooter animals, how old are they when you're selling them?
So typically, in the past, you saw shooter animals being sold around 4 to 5 years of age, and you're seeing that significant, or 4 to 5 years of age, some 6 to 7, but you're significantly seeing that age decrease. So here in the States now, we're selling more 3 and 4-year-old shooter fallow, where in the past it's been, 4, 5, and 6-year-olds.
And one of the other questions I have is, over the last several years, we've seen a lot of people buying like a quarter interest or 50% interest in one particular animal or whatever the case may be.
Yes.
For people that are not in this today, but maybe are living with their toe in the water and learning a little bit about it, that might be a great avenue for them to look. Could you talk a little bit about how that works? What does that model look like when someone buys a quarter interest in an animal? How do they get their return on investment? And kind of over what time frame does that work? Because some of the prices, they're really, really bananas.
Yes.
But there's no shortage of people continuing to buy them, so there must be a reason.
Yeah, so great question here on partnership animals. I'm going to use an example of an animal this year. Macho Man is a 3-year-old fallow that we have that has an incredible pedigree, giant fallow. We sold 0.25% interest in Macho Man for $125,000 a piece. We sold up to 50% of him, so I have 3 partners on him now. In that 25% interest, they're getting to bring 8 does to get live bred to them, and they're going to get 8 straws of semen per partnership so that they can use that to breed their does. And then they also get a share in semen cells. So as we sell those straws of semen for, say, $4,000 a straw, they'll each get $1,000 a straw per straw sold. So each partnership is structured a little bit different. Some of the partnerships, we will weight heavy in on it to say, hey, look, we're not going to take any of the semen cells, percentages of the semen cells until you're paid in full. Some people want to be creative with it and say, look, I really don't want the money back. I just want ranch credit. You keep all the proceeds and just give me a little bit heavier weighted ranch credit. So instead of somebody getting $1,000 cash, they say, well, can I get, that 50% of that back as ranch credit within T because, we want to buy more semen or we want to, get a doe from you or something like that as well. So it's really, yes, sir.
So in a partnership like that, where each partner gets 8 does, are you looking at that club 5 covering 32 does?
Yes.
And you don't see,
What's that?
you don't see any big antler decrease?
Occasionally you see some antler decrease, and that's shows up a lot in genetic lines. Certain genetic lines seem to not have an antler decrease in size. Some of them seem to figure it out the next year and it not take as big a toll on their antler size. So it's just, I've noticed it in certain lines, certain maternal lines, that when you breed them, that decreases the antler size. When you kind of rest them or give them a lighter load, they don't seem to be affected. And I've seen a few lines that I experimented with thinking that, hey, I'm going to give him a lesser load and he's going to be a giant. And it did not work out that way. He actually did less. So still trying to figure out some of the maternal lines and the hormones associated with their breeding patterns. And it's very much like any of us in a sense of, some deer have different metabolism rates, some have different levels of different hormones. So no two bucks are the same, but you do see genetic lines that show that.
If I heard you correctly, you're saying 125 grand for a quarter interest, so that would value that buck at $500,000.
Correct.
And from what I've seen, there's no shortage of demand. People are buying these actively in these partnerships. Is that accurate?
Yes, yeah, so the fallow industry has continued to grow. I think this year I've seen the most growth in a single year. of new people getting into it. And I really initially thought that it was gonna be a lot of people transitioning from whitetail to fallow because they already had the infrastructure, they already had the breeding facility and the pens, and that hasn't actually been the case. I've seen a lot of new people that are just starting straight fresh, bought some land, bought 30, 40 acres, and they're putting up a high fence facility to raise fallow. And some of them are coming over and they're saying, hey, I'm gonna start with 4 pens this year because that's what I can get up, and I'm gonna grow from there. And you know, they wanna come over and get in on the best buck at the top because there's only so many deer that can be marketed within a given time, and because of the rate of the fallow progression, if you will, because we're really figuring out nutritional aspects of these animals. Deer that were considered big, you know, 7, 8 years ago, people now are looking at them like, well, that's not that big of a fallow compared to today's fallow. And a lot of that has to do with nutrition, the genetics. The genetics are improving, but they didn't jump that far ahead. It's just those animals weren't cared for or given the same opportunities as today's animals are given, if that makes sense.
So it seems to me, and what I've watched, is that in the fallow, breeders have, to an extent, cracked the code in terms of how to grow really great bucks and how to breed from a genetic standpoint to produce these outcomes. And now they're kind of fine tuning that system. How far behind is the access industry in terms of its growth in solving, you know, what ultimately is the key goal, which is to produce a massive animal? Because the reason I'm asking is that people that got into the fallow game in 2017, or actually, I think Thunderstruck was sold in 15, 16, something like that.
Yeah.
People that got in then and going through this cycle is going to have massive benefits and huge financial returns for people. That's probably still got a lot of availability, but it's a much more mature market. Do you think that the access side, because of the lack of advancement thus far, that there's tremendous opportunity for people to get in because the code still hasn't been cracked? They haven't solved they haven't figured out how to create a massive animal, and the people that end up doing that are the ones that are going to get better.
Yeah, yes, I do think there's a lot to merit in that. The question was about the access market being in its infancy, if you will. Does there seem to be a much larger return for people getting into the access market early on? And I think the answer is yes, but I don't have a crystal ball to say, hey, it's going to be easy to crack the code and breed them in the smaller pens, just based off of what I've seen. I'm reverting back to moving my my bucks that are growing out into bigger pens, like 5 to 10 acre pens, as opposed to 1.5, 2 acre pens. There hasn't been as much significant increase in growth that I've seen yet, but the problem that I've seen as well in there is I don't think that I've done the best job at managing the access herd because of the fact that coming into it with a whitetail mind and a fallow mind, and they're operating off of the photo period, so it's very easy to say, hey, this is the rut, this is when they're breeding, pull the bucks, do this, very easy to manage. With the access deer, they breed year round. Access will breed back within the first 10 to 20 days after having a baby. So you're constantly having babies born consistently, so you're trying to wean, work deer, make sure that you have the deer bred, put them together so that you can do more selective breeding and just fit them into your schedule. So I think as time goes on, and I think that people getting in now and talking to people that have been doing access, it would be a great opportunity because they won't have to go through the learning curves that we've had, because I'm willing to share that information. I'm sure the other guys that I know that are in the access industry are willing to share that information as well. But I do think there's a tremendous amount of growth there as well for people that are willing to put in the time and effort into figuring that out. And there's a big difference in access from wild caught access to pen raised access. And even wild caught access that have stayed in pens for several years are still not the same at all. I mean, bottle-raised animals that get mixed with axis, they will revert back. Nature will outperform nurture almost 100% of the time when dealing with axis. So, and what I'm meaning there is if you took 50% of your pen, say you had 15 bottle-raised axis does and you put them in with 10 wild-caught axis does, they're gonna go back to revert towards nature and be wild again. It doesn't mean you can't remove them and calm them back down, but it's gonna take some effort there. So that's, yes, sir.
Well, there's one other thing I think is important to discuss about axis versus some of these other species, is that right now, in the genetic world, the axis are still being looked at very, very, under the spotlight about CWD. And some of the top scientists in the country still believe that it's there, we just haven't found it. So I think that's something for people to at least know in the background, because that could change the world.
Yes. If you didn't hear him, it said that all those axes are not designated as CWD susceptible. They are being scrutinized, and I think there are some people that probably would love to be able to find it or something of that nature with axis deer. Fallow, one of the big benefits on them as well is they are non-susceptible CWD, and they have already went through the scrutinization. They have already put them and exposed them to high levels of the prion, and they have been deemed a non-susceptible species. And I think it's only a matter of time that a lot of these other states go into their state statutes and remove fallow from, and I guess reclassify their importation requirements, because a lot of states just say cervidae, which fallow just fall underneath there. And a lot of states I'm already seeing that they're already discussing to go in there and specify which species, because now that, you know, we're 15 years into this or so, you know, they're realizing, okay, it's not all cervids, it's just specific ones. So there's some designation there. One of the other things I was going to mention, though, that about fallow that make them really interesting type of animal, especially exotics, is the fact that they can survive in a lot of different climates. I mean, there's fallow breeders in Mexico and there's fallow breeders in Canada. You don't see that very often with exotic species and things of that nature. Being a deer species and a cervid, you've seen that. Axis, they don't put on a winter coat. They don't do well too far north. I think Missouri is probably the furthest that I know of people that are really raising some axis deer. But the good thing is that Texas is kind of the mecca for axis hunting anyways. So it's not like there's a big market to send axis up there as is. I think that's really it. I had a lot of stuff about tax incentives and whatnot, but like I said, Brian covered all that. I'm not even gonna try to even cover it nearly as good as he does. So, any other questions? Yes.
You said that you don't have the demand, or you have too much of a demand and running out. Some people might think you sell 10 stockers a year. How many stocker fallows do you sell this year? How many do you sell?
This year I sold about 60 stalker bucks for fallow. Next year I plan to sell probably close to 85 or so. And then in the following year I probably plan to spend about 150. So yeah, the whitetail, like I said, I saw it in the whitetail side, and we sell about 400 whitetail stalkers a year to go and get shot. So, and I have a standing order on axis for 100 axis shooter bucks. So the demand is significantly high, and like I said, I can't even supply a quarter of what I get asked for.
What's the downfall rate?
That's a very difficult question. So his question was, when do I see the fallow bucks start to decline based off of their antler growth? Is that correct? That's a hard question to answer because our nutrition has gotten so much better Years ago, I would have said once they reach about 7 or 8 years of age, they start to taper off, 9, 10. But because we're improving their nutrition in the way that we're handling these deer, Mr. Big, for instance, he's 10 years old and he's the biggest he's ever been this year. So I would not have guessed that at all. I would have thought they would start tapering down. So I think to answer your question, time will tell. But if I had to take a guess, I would guess around the age of 13 or so is when they start to, taper off. But next year I might tell you 11. Any other questions? Oh, yes, sir. Depending on the age of the deer, I normally run like a 2-year-old buck. I normally would put like on 20 does, a 3-year-old on 30 does, and a 4-year-old on 40 plus does. Is that the question? Yes, sir. And typically, like where we are, which is the Giddings area, I can run about 25 does in about 1.5 acres, and they'll fawn out in there, and the grass will maintain and things like that. I know that's different per region, though, for sure, on how to keep up with the grass.
All right, thank you, Nash. So I just, my hope in bringing Nash here was to, open the door to people that maybe aren't in the fallow industry but have been watching it and want to learn a little bit more about it. Nash, you do offer pens, tours of your pens, correct? So if there's anybody that wants to get with Nash and schedule a tour of his pens and go out and look and see exactly what it is that he's doing and how it works, he would be more than happy to take you out and show you that. And I think that the model around these partnership animals is very interesting. You qualify for tax benefits just like you do if you own the animal. But the financial model is very interesting when you start integrating semen sales. It gives you the ability to get return on investment very quickly. And so when you see these animals that are selling for these astronomically high prices, where our brain says, okay, well, how's a fallow buck worth 500 grand? Well, when they're selling semen at $4,000 a straw, it just doesn't take that long to get your money back when there's demand for the semen. And what I've seen is that the calmer the animal, the more likely the success is when it comes to doing AI. And fallow are generally fairly calm, and it seems like they've gotten better and better and better at doing AI and doing embryo work and things like that. And so it seems to me that that model works fairly well at this point. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. So if anybody wants to reach out to Nash, he's more than happy to give you a pen tour, and we will move forward from there. Thanks, Nash. Okay. Next is one of my favorite people, Mr. Chandler Bartley. So Chandler works for